Why was a stranger holding Caleb Morgan's shotgun on the porch of the home he expected to find abandoned? The shotgun clicked against Sarah Parker's shoulder as the giant cowboy stepped from the dusk. Chimney smoke curled above the ranch house. Then Daniel burst through the door. "Uncle Caleb, don't scare Sarah. She saved Mama." Caleb froze. What had happened during those 5 weeks? "Stay with us and tell us what you think." Caleb Morgan saw smoke above the cottonwoods and pulled his horse to a stop. For a long moment, he sat without moving. The evening wind came down from the Bighorn Mountains, cold enough to carry the first warning of autumn. It moved through the yellow grass, rattled the dry seed heads along the fence, and tugged at the brim of Caleb's hat. His horse, Buck, shifted beneath him. Caleb kept looking at the chimney. Smoke. That made no sense. 5 weeks earlier, Rebecca had stood beside this same gate, with her arms folded, and told him she was finished waiting for him to become part of his own family. "I mean it this time, Caleb." He had tightened a cinch strap instead of answering. Rebecca had followed him toward the barn. "I can take Daniel and Emily back east. Aunt Martha will make room." Caleb remembered stopping then. Not turning around. Just stopping. This is your home. A house can belong to you and still not feel like home. He had disliked that sentence enough to carry it with him for nearly 600 miles. The cattle drive had taken longer than expected. 2 swollen crossings, a lame steer, 3 days lost when a buyer delayed payment in Casper. By the time Caleb finally turned north again, he had convinced himself Rebecca would be gone. Maybe that was better. At least then he would not have to watch his niece and nephew learn to stop expecting anything from him. Yet smoke rose steadily from the chimney. A second thing bothered him. Lamplight glowed from the kitchen window. Rebecca never lit the lamps this early unless weather was coming. Caleb touched his heels to Buck. The big bay moved forward. The Morgan Ranch came slowly into view beneath the fading sky. Main house, barn, bunkhouse, smokehouse, corrals stretching east toward the creek. Everything looked where it belonged. Almost. One section of fence beside the lower pasture had been rebuilt. Fresh rails. Caleb narrowed his eyes. He had not ordered that repair. The north gate stood shut, but someone had wrapped a new length of rawhide around the hinge. He had not done that either. Buck carried him through the yard. No ranch hands came out. No Daniel running toward him. No Emily hiding behind Rebecca's skirts. That silence bothered him more than the smoke. Caleb swung down. After 5 weeks in the saddle, his 6'6" frame unfolded stiffly. Dust coated his boots almost to the knee. His beard had grown rough. His long brown coat smelled of horse, leather, smoke, and trail. He looped Buck's rein around the hitching rail. The front door opened. Caleb turned. A woman stepped onto his porch carrying his shotgun. His shotgun. For one stunned second, that offended him more than anything else. Then he looked at the woman holding it. She was a stranger. Early 30s, perhaps. Brown hair pinned back in a practical knot, though loose strands curled around a face flushed from the kitchen heat. Fair skin, full cheeks, a broad, soft figure beneath a dark blue dress and a white apron dusted with flour. She was a large woman, not tall like him, but solidly built, with strong arms and a generous shape that the plain dress did nothing to hide. And she knew how to hold a shotgun. That caught his attention. The stock rested firmly against her shoulder. The barrel remained pointed toward the dirt, a few feet in front of him, rather than directly at his chest. Careful. Not frightened enough to become foolish, Caleb took his hand away from his coat. The woman noticed. Her eyes dropped briefly toward his gun belt, then returned to his face. "Stay where you are." Her voice was steady. Caleb looked toward his own front door, then back at her. "This is my house." That's what the last man said. Caleb's expression changed. only slightly. What last man? You first. She tightened her grip on the shotgun. Name. He stared at her. She stared back. A chicken wandered beneath the porch and scratched at the dirt between them. Somewhere inside the house, a pot lid rattled. Caleb slowly removed his hat. Caleb Morgan. Nothing changed in her face. Anybody can know that. His eyebrows lifted. She nodded toward the barn. What's the gray mare's name? Molly. What did Daniel break last winter? My shaving mirror. A pause. What does Emily hide under the back porch? Buttons. That did it. The woman lowered the barrel another inch. Not completely. Caleb almost respected that. Who are you? Before she could answer, the front door flew wider. Uncle Caleb! Daniel came running barefoot across the porch. Caleb barely had time to bend before the boy hit him around the waist. Daniel had grown. That was Caleb's first thought. His second was that the boy looked thinner. His third came when he saw the fading bruise along Daniel's temple. Caleb's hand settled on the back of his nephew's head. What happened to you? Daniel ignored the question. He looked toward the woman and then back at Caleb. Don't scare Sarah. Caleb glanced at the shotgun. I'm scaring her? Daniel seemed to consider that. Well, don't make her shoot you. Daniel. The woman, Sarah, said his name in a warning tone. The boy immediately closed his mouth. That interested Caleb almost as much as the shotgun. Daniel Morgan had never obeyed anybody that quickly in his life. Then Daniel said the words that stopped everything. She saved Mama. Caleb's hand went still against the boy's hair. The yard seemed to quiet around him. What? Daniel looked toward the house. Mama got sick. Real sick. Mr. Harris went to town and brought Sarah and then the creek. Daniel. Sarah's voice softened this time. The boy stopped. Caleb was already looking past them. A figure stood inside the doorway. Rebecca. His sister had always been slender, but now she looked reduced somehow. Her dress hung loose around her shoulders. One hand rested against the doorframe. She was alive. That should not have been the first thought when looking at his 35-year-old sister. But it was. Alive. Caleb crossed the yard in 3 strides. Rebecca barely had time to straighten before he reached the porch. He stopped short of touching her. That old habit. 4 years of measuring every movement before it became affection. Rebecca looked up at him. You took your time. His throat worked. What happened? A great many things. You're sick. Not anymore. You look sick. Thank you. 5 weeks away, and you return charming as ever. He might have answered on another day. Instead, Caleb looked toward Sarah. She had lowered the shotgun now. Flour marked one side of her apron. There was a small burn on her wrist. A loose lock of brown hair had fallen against her cheek, but she made no attempt to fix it. What did he mean? Sarah glanced at Rebecca before answering. Your sister had pneumonia. Caleb's eyes returned immediately to Rebecca. How bad? Rebecca gave Sarah a look. Sarah did not soften it for him. Bad enough. Caleb's jaw tightened. Why wasn't I told? We tried, Rebecca said. How? George rode to Dry Creek. Nobody knew where along the drive you were. Your schedule changed twice. You could have sent someone south. With whom, Caleb? The question landed harder than it should have. Rebecca continued. Half the hands were moving the upper herd. Frank said he couldn't spare anyone else. At the mention of Frank Turner, Sarah's eyes changed. Barely. Caleb saw it. He had spent 20 years reading cattle, horses, hired men, buyers, thieves, and weather. Tiny changes mattered. Sarah Parker did not trust his foreman. "Where is Frank?" "Not here," she said. Caleb looked directly at her. "I asked Rebecca, and she gets tired easily." His head tilted. Rebecca closed her eyes. Oh, Lord. Sarah held Caleb's gaze. For the first time in years, Caleb Morgan found himself facing someone inside his own house who appeared completely unimpressed by him. It should have angered him. Instead, something unfamiliar tugged briefly at one corner of his mouth. He stopped it before it became a smile. Rebecca noticed anyway. That seemed to irritate him further. "Come inside," she said, "before the two of you decide to measure horns in the yard." Sarah's cheeks colored. Caleb picked up his saddlebag. "I'm not finished asking questions." "No," Sarah said. "I imagine you've only begun." She turned and walked inside carrying his shotgun. Caleb watched her go. There was flour on the back of her apron, too. Daniel tugged his sleeve. "She makes apple biscuits." "That so?" "And she pulled me out of the creek." Caleb stopped again. Slowly, he looked down. "What creek?" Daniel's face changed. Rebecca closed the door behind them and leaned against it. "Sit down, Caleb." He did not sit. Inside, the house smelled of onions, coffee, wood smoke, and something baking. Caleb looked around. The table had been scrubbed. A mended curtain hung over the east window. Emily's wooden horse sat beside a stack of school papers. Rebecca's medicine bottles stood neatly near the stove. Fresh bread rested beneath a cloth. There were muddy children's boots lined against the wall instead of scattered across the room. Someone had repaired the broken cupboard latch he had ignored for nearly a year. And above all of it came the sound of life. Daniel talking, a spoon striking a pot, Rebecca breathing, someone moving in the pantry. Caleb had left this house 5 weeks ago, certain he knew exactly what would be waiting when he returned. Either Rebecca and the children would still be here, angry and disappointed, or they would be gone. He had prepared himself for both. He had not prepared himself for Sarah Parker. She returned from the pantry without the shotgun. Caleb noticed she had placed it within reach beside the kitchen door. Still cautious. Still watching him. He looked at his sister. Then Daniel. Then the unfamiliar woman standing in his kitchen, as though she had somehow spent 5 weeks gathering the scattered pieces of his family and refusing to let them fall any farther. "What happened while I was gone?" Nobody answered at once. Outside, the last light disappeared behind the bighorns, and for the first time since Caleb Morgan rode through his own gate, he understood that the question was much larger than he had thought. 5 weeks earlier, that same yard had looked different. The grass beside the well was still green then, and summer heat lay over the Morgan ranch from sunrise until long after supper. Dust hung in the corrals whenever cattle moved. Flies worried the horses. By noon, even the iron pump handle felt warm against the palm. Caleb had been tightening the cinch on Buck when Rebecca found him beside the barn. "You're going anyway." It was not a question. Caleb pulled the leather strap through the buckle and tested it once. "The buyers won't wait." Rebecca stood with both hands folded over her apron. Neither would Daniel, Caleb thought. Neither would Emily. He did not say it. Beyond the fence, George Harris and 3 younger hands were moving the first group of steers toward the south gate. Frank Turner stood near them checking numbers in the cattle book. Everything was ready. That was how Caleb preferred things. Prepared, counted, necessary. Rebecca stepped closer. "I told you what I'm thinking." Caleb finally looked at her. His sister had their mother's eyes. gray, sharp, and particularly difficult to ignore when she believed a person was being foolish. "I heard you." "No. You stood there while I spoke. That isn't the same thing." Caleb's jaw shifted. "Rebecca, I can take the children east." His hand stopped on Buck's saddle. "Aunt Martha still has that house outside Omaha. She said we can stay until I figure something out. This is your home." Rebecca looked toward the house. Daniel was sitting on the porch step carving something from a scrap of pine with a dull pocket knife. Emily was beside him arranging buttons in a row, according to colors only she understood. A house can belong to you and still not feel like home. Caleb turned back to the saddle. That should have ended the conversation. Rebecca refused to let it. "You provide everything, I know. Beef, flour, firewood, school books, shoes when Daniel wears through his. You pay the doctor, you fix the roof, you make sure we're safe." Caleb gave the saddle strap another unnecessary pull. "What exactly is wrong with that?" Rebecca's voice lowered. "You make sure we're safe from everything except knowing you." That brought his eyes back to hers. For a second, neither moved. From inside the barn came the dull knock of a hoof against a stall board. Rebecca glanced toward the children. "Daniel watches for you every evening. He sees me. He sees you crossing the yard." "I'm working. I know." Something in her face softened, which somehow made it worse. "And Emily stopped asking whether you'll read to her because you always say maybe tomorrow." Caleb's mouth tightened. "I'm gone 5 weeks, Rebecca. Not 5 years. That isn't what I'm talking about." He knew. That was why he mounted. Buck shifted under his weight. Rebecca stepped away from the horse. "I mean it this time, Caleb. I may be gone when you get back." He looked down at her. There were several things he might have said. "Stay. Wait for me." "I'll try." He settled for, "Frank has the ranch books. George knows the north pasture. If anything breaks, send to Dry Creek." Rebecca gave a small nod. Then she walked back toward the house. Caleb watched her go until Daniel looked up from the porch. The boy lifted one hand. Caleb raised his own. Emily did not see him leave. By sunset, the Morgan cattle were 3 miles south. Caleb did not turn back. 4 days later, Sarah Parker climbed down from a freight wagon in Dry Creek with a trunk, 2 cast-iron pans, and $11.40 to her name. The driver set her trunk beside the hitching post outside Bennett's Mercantile and wiped his forehead with a red handkerchief. "That everything?" Sarah looked at the trunk, then at the 2 pans tied together with cord, then at the empty road behind them. "Yes." The driver glanced at her as if he expected more belongings from a woman of 33. Sarah had once owned more. A blue china serving bowl, 3 good Sunday dresses, a walnut sewing box, a brass lamp that had belonged to her mother. Life had a way of reducing possessions one decision at a time until everything important could fit inside one trunk. She paid the driver 20 cents. He touched the brim of his hat and climbed back onto the wagon. Dry Creek was little more than one broad dirt street bordered by false front buildings faded by sun. There was a blacksmith, a feed store, a church with a whitewashed steeple, 2 saloons, a small hotel, and a mercantile whose front window displayed work gloves, canned peaches, lamp chimneys, and a red coffee mill. Sarah stood beside her trunk for a moment. She wore a brown traveling dress that had once fitted loosely. It did not anymore. Years of kitchen work and regular tasting had added softness to her hips, stomach, and arms. She had stopped pretending she could alter every dress enough to hide it. The boarding house owner and Casper had noticed too. Mr. Whitcomb had purchased the place in June. On his 3rd morning, he stood in the kitchen doorway watching Sarah roll biscuit dough. You cook well. I should hope so. I've done it 11 years. He had rubbed his mustache. My wife wants younger girls serving the dining room. I work in the kitchen. She wants a different sort of appearance throughout. Sarah had stared at him until his gaze wandered toward the floor. He paid what he owed her. Almost. She had made him recalculate the final 2 days after noticing they were missing from the receipt. Then she packed. Now she was in Dry Creek because the stage farther north cost more than she was willing to spend until she found work. Sarah lifted one cast iron pan. The mercantile door opened before she could reach for the trunk. An older man came out carrying a sack of oats over one shoulder. Gray hair showed beneath his hat. His shirt was sweat-darkened between the shoulder blades. He almost passed her. Then he stopped. "Need a hand, ma'am?" Sarah looked at him. The question held no impatience, no smirk. "That trunk is heavier than it looks. So am I." The man blinked. Sarah waited. Then he laughed. It was a short, surprised laugh. All right. Fair warning received. Together they carried the trunk inside. The proprietor rented Sarah a small room above the mercantile for 50 cents a night. It had one narrow bed, a washstand, and a window facing the stable. Not much. Enough. Sarah spent the afternoon asking about work. The hotel already had a cook. The saloons wanted women for jobs Sarah did not intend to take. The preacher's wife offered laundry at 12 cents a dozen pieces, which would barely cover the room. By late afternoon, Sarah returned to Bennett's mercantile tired, dusty, and no richer. She was examining a handwritten notice advertising seasonal kitchen help at a logging camp 40 miles north, when she heard the older man again. "I'm telling you, Mr. Bennett, she needs somebody now." Sarah looked toward the counter. The man who had carried her trunk stood there with his hat crushed between both hands. The storekeeper frowned. "George, I can ask around. That's all I can do. Around when?" "Tomorrow." She might not have tomorrow. Sarah's fingers went still on the paper. George exhaled hard. "The doctor says she needs rest, warm food, somebody keeping the young ones from burning down the place. Daniel's 9. He's trying, but 9 ain't enough." "What about Turner?" "Frank manages cattle. He don't manage sick women." Sarah turned. "Who is sick?" Both men looked at her. George recognized her first. "The lady from outside. Sarah Parker." He removed his hat. "George Harris." She nodded toward the counter. "Who needs help?" George hesitated. "My boss's sister. Mrs. Morgan. Rebecca Morgan." "How sick?" "Caught cold after getting soaked bringing calves in during that storm last week. Doctor says it's settled in her chest. Pneumonia. That's what he called it." Sarah looked through the front window. Evening shadows were lengthening across Dry Creek. "Where is she?" "Morgan Ranch. 14 miles northwest. You said she has children." "Boy and girl." "Who is cooking?" George scratched his jaw. "Mostly Daniel." Sarah stared at him. "He's 9? George looked embarrassed. "We've been taking things from the bunkhouse when we can." "And her husband?" "Dead 3 years." "Other family?" "Her brother owns the ranch." "Where is he?" "Cattle drive." Sarah looked back at the logging notice in her hand. 40 miles north. Steady wages. No sick woman. No children. No complications. George seemed to read part of the argument happening on her face. "I ain't asking for charity. Morgan pays fair." "I don't know Mr. Morgan." "Most folks don't." The storekeeper snorted softly. George ignored him. "He'll pay you." "That isn't what I said." "No, ma'am." Sarah folded the logging notice once, then again. How long? George considered. 3 days? You don't sound certain. I'm hoping she turns the corner. Sarah thought about her $11.40. About the room upstairs. About the little logging notice. Then about a 9-year-old boy standing over a cook stove while his mother struggled to breathe. She put the notice back on the wall. 3 days. George's shoulders dropped. 3 days, he agreed quickly. I want wages stated beforehand. Yes, ma'am. And if the doctor has given instructions, I follow those. Not ranch house opinions. George nearly smiled. Yes, ma'am. And I'm not a nurse. Understood. Sarah looked down at her traveling dress. Give me 10 minutes to change. The road to the Morgan Ranch climbed gradually away from Dry Creek, crossing open grassland before entering a stretch of pine where evening came early beneath the trees. George drove a light buckboard. Sarah sat beside him with her trunk behind them and the 2 pans wrapped in a blanket to keep them from clattering. The air cooled as they climbed. You work for Morgan long? She asked. 11 years. What kind of man is he? George considered so long that Sarah turned toward him. Big, he finally said. I gathered that from the ranch name. No, I mean big. Sarah waited. 6'6", maybe more in boots. That sounds inconvenient indoors. George laughed again. Then his expression settled. He's fair. Works harder than anybody he hires. Keeps his word. But? George watched the road. Didn't used to be a but. Sarah did not press. They reached the Morgan Ranch after dark. The house stood beneath cottonwoods beside a narrow creek, its windows showing only 2 weak lamps. Sarah stepped down from the buckboard. Before George could reach her trunk, the front door opened. A boy stood there, thin, barefoot, holding a wooden spoon like a weapon. Behind him, something shattered. A little girl began crying. Then Sarah heard it. A woman coughing. Not an ordinary cough, deep, wet, dragging for breath afterward. Sarah left her trunk in the yard. She walked straight toward the house. George followed. I told you she was sick. Sarah stopped at the threshold and looked back at him. No, she said quietly. You told me she needed help. Another hard cough came from the bedroom. Sarah turned toward it. This woman needs a doctor. George's face drained. He was here yesterday. Then go get him again. Now? Sarah was already rolling up her sleeves. Now. And before George Harris had his hat back on, Sarah Parker stepped into the Morgan house for what she believed would be 3 days. The front room smelled of damp wool, wood smoke, and something burned in a skillet. Daniel stood near the stove with the spoon still in his hand. The little girl had stopped crying, but only because she had pressed both fists against her mouth. Sarah crouched. What's your name? Emily. I'm Sarah. Emily nodded once. Daniel did not. He looked toward the bedroom. Mama don't like strangers. That makes 2 of us. That brought the smallest change to his face. Not a smile. Almost. Sarah rose and went to the bedroom door. Rebecca Morgan lay propped against 2 pillows beneath a faded quilt. Her hair stuck damply to her temples. Each breath seemed to catch halfway in. Sarah crossed the room and touched the back of her fingers to Rebecca's forehead. Hot. Too hot. Rebecca opened her eyes. Who are you? Sarah Parker. Why? It took Sarah a second to understand. George brought me. I don't need... A cough cut the sentence apart. Sarah waited until it passed. Then she reached for the water pitcher. You can argue with me after you drink. Rebecca stared at her. Sarah held the cup. After a moment, Rebecca took it. That was enough. By the time George returned with Dr. Miller 2 hours later, Sarah had opened the bedroom window a crack, moved a chair close to the bed, cleaned the kitchen, fed both children, and found 3 different pots with food burned into the bottoms. The doctor was a narrow man with a leather bag polished smooth at the corners. He listened to Rebecca's chest, asked questions, checked her pulse. Then he looked at Sarah. She needs rest. Warm liquids. Keep her from getting chilled. I can do that. If her breathing worsens, send for me. Sarah nodded. Rebecca tried to sit up. You don't have to stay. Sarah tucked the blanket higher around her. That's fortunate. Rebecca frowned. Sarah picked up the basin. I already agreed to 3 days. The next morning began before sunrise. Sarah woke on the parlor settee with one hand numb beneath her cheek. The house was quiet. For a moment, she did not remember where she was. Then Rebecca coughed. Sarah sat up. Daniel was asleep on the floor beside the stove with a coat rolled under his head. Emily was curled in the chair. Sarah looked at the cold ashes in the stove, then at the children. She put on her shoes. By 6, the fire was going. By 7, oatmeal simmered in a pot. Sarah found a heel of bacon wrapped in paper, half a jar of sorghum, and enough flour for biscuits if she used it carefully. That bothered her. A ranch this size should have had more. When Daniel came into the kitchen, he watched her spoon oatmeal into 3 bowls. 4, Sarah said. I'm not hungry. You were staring at the pot. No, ma'am. She added a 4th bowl anyway. Daniel's eyes followed it. Sarah set it in front of him. He looked toward Emily's place. She needs more. Sarah understood then. She took another spoonful from the pot and divided it between them. There. Daniel hesitated. Then he ate. Fast. Too fast. Sarah said nothing. That afternoon she made broth from a chicken George brought from the smokehouse yard. She skimmed it carefully, added onion, a little salt. Nothing rich. Rebecca drank half a cup and slept for 3 hours afterward. On the second day, Sarah washed sheets in hot water and hung them behind the house where the sun could reach them. Emily followed her carrying clothespins in both hands. Daniel split kindling badly and refused help until the hatchet caught in a knot. Sarah held out her hand. Let me see. I can do it. I know. He looked at her. She tilted her head toward the stuck blade. Knowing how and doing it well are different things. He let go. Sarah freed the hatchet, then handed it back. Again. By the 3rd day, Rebecca could sit at the kitchen table for supper. Not long. 10 minutes. But she sat. George smiled when he saw her. Daniel talked through the whole meal. Emily fell asleep with her head against Sarah's arm. Sarah looked around the table and knew what she was supposed to do the next morning. Leave. She had done what she agreed to do. Rebecca was improving. The doctor had been back and said the worst might be passing. Sarah had already packed her dress. She had folded her shawl and placed it over the trunk. After breakfast, she carried the trunk as far as the front door. Then she went back for the shawl. It was gone. Sarah stood in the parlor. Emily? No answer. She checked the chair, the peg by the kitchen. Then she saw it. Her shawl hung exactly where it had been before, on the hook beside the pantry door. Emily sat on the floor under it, arranging buttons. Sarah looked at her. Emily did not look up. You moved my shawl, no. It walked? Emily considered that. Maybe. Sarah put both hands on her hips. From the kitchen table, Rebecca covered a smile with her coffee cup. Sarah noticed. "You're encouraging this. I'm too weak to intervene." Sarah looked back at Emily. The girl moved a red button beside a blue one, then quietly said, "Mama still coughs at night." Sarah's hands fell to her sides. She closed her eyes for a second. "One more night." Emily nodded. One more night became 3. 3 became 7. Sarah stopped counting after the second week. By then, Rebecca could walk from the bedroom to the porch without help, though she had to rest afterward. Daniel had stopped lying about being hungry. Emily had learned that Sarah kept cinnamon in the small tin beside the stove and began asking for the brown sugar on everything. The ranch house changed by inches, not enough for anyone to notice in a single day. A cleaned window, a patched dish towel, fresh bread cooling beneath muslin, a jar of wildflowers on the table. Sarah found a broken latch in the cupboard and fixed it with a bent nail and a pair of pliers. George brought eggs twice a week. The men from the bunkhouse began appearing at the back door with excuses. Thought Mrs. Morgan might need this. They would hand over potatoes or dried beans. Once, a sack of coffee. Sarah accepted everything. Then she started asking questions. "Where's the flower order from July?" George scratched his chin. "What flower order?" "The one in Rebecca's account book." Rebecca had shown Sarah the household ledger after Sarah mentioned the pantry seemed light. The book was simple. Dates, items, amounts. Caleb Morgan had left enough provisions before the drive to carry the house well into fall. Yet the shelves did not match the pages. 20 pounds of flour missing. 3 sacks of beans, coffee, salt pork, 2 tins of peaches, soap, kerosene. At first, Sarah thought the children had been eating more than Rebecca remembered. Then she counted again. No. Too much was gone. "Maybe Frank moved some to the bunkhouse," George said. "Does the bunkhouse keep its own stores?" George paused. "Yes." Sarah looked at him. He looked uncomfortable. That afternoon, she checked the smokehouse. The cured meat hooks were nearly empty. She found receipts in a wooden box beside Rebecca's desk. The last supply wagon from Dry Creek had been paid in full. Nothing missing there. The numbers were wrong somewhere else. Sarah said little. She watched. Over the next several days, she noticed Frank Turner came to the house often enough to ask about Rebecca, but never entered farther than the kitchen. He was thick through the shoulders, with graying hair and a neatly trimmed beard. Polite, always polite. He called Sarah Miss Parker. He took off his hat inside. He asked whether she needed anything from town, but his eyes moved. Pantry, desk, cupboard, then back to her. One evening after supper, Sarah waited until Rebecca and the children were asleep. She lit one lamp and went into the pantry with the ledger. She counted everything again. Flour, coffee, salt, beans, lard. Then cattle feed receipts Rebecca had tucked into the back of the book. Sarah frowned. 3 entries had been altered, not erased. Scraped lightly and rewritten. She brought the lamp closer. Outside, a board creaked. Sarah froze. Footsteps crossed the kitchen. Slow, unhurried. The pantry doorway darkened. Frank Turner stood there with one hand resting on the frame. He looked at the ledger, then at the open sacks around Sarah. "Working late, Miss Parker?" Sarah closed the book. "Seems so." Frank smiled. It was a pleasant smile. That was what made it worse. His eyes did not smile at all. Frank Turner leaned against the pantry frame as though he had wandered in by accident. Sarah kept one hand on Rebecca's ledger. "You looking for something?" he asked. "I found it." His gaze moved to the open flour sack, then to the coffee tin, then back to her face. Mrs. Morgan keeps poor count when she's sick. She kept fine count before she got sick. Frank gave a small shrug. Supplies move around on a ranch. So do cattle? That stopped him, only for a second. Sarah opened the ledger again and turned it toward the lamp. 3 steers listed here. Branded in June. No sale noted. No butcher record. No loss. Frank did not step closer, but the room suddenly felt smaller. You been reading ranch books now? I've been reading numbers. That ain't your concern. No. No. Sarah closed the ledger. Frank's smile returned. Caleb trusts me. Sarah studied him. I haven't met Caleb. Then maybe don't make judgments about things you don't understand. His voice stayed low, polite. That somehow made Sarah's shoulders stiffen more than shouting would have. From the bedroom came Rebecca's cough. Frank looked toward the sound. Sarah noticed. So where did the steers go? Frank's jaw moved once. Probably traded. For what? Feed. Fencing. Medicine. Which receipt? The smile disappeared. Outside, a horse stamped near the barn. Sarah could hear the wind rubbing dry branches against the side of the house. Frank took one step into the pantry. Sarah did not move. He was broader than she had realized. Not as tall as the stories made Caleb Morgan sound, but thick through the chest and arms, a man accustomed to moving heavy gates and stubborn cattle. Sarah put the ledger down, not because she was afraid of him, because she wanted both hands free. Frank noticed that too. Then Rebecca called from the kitchen. Sarah? Frank stepped back. Just like that. The pleasant expression returned. Best not trouble Mrs. Morgan with bookkeeping while she's healing. Sarah picked up the lamp. I wasn't planning to. He touched 2 fingers to the brim of his hat. Good night, Miss Parker. She waited until the kitchen door closed behind him. Then she locked it. The next morning, Frank behaved as though nothing had happened. That was another thing Sarah disliked. He spoke kindly to Daniel, brought a sack of potatoes from the bunkhouse, asked Rebecca whether she needed anything from Dry Creek. When Sarah came into the room, he nodded. Morning. Sarah nodded back. Nothing more. Rebecca noticed. She waited until Frank had ridden away before asking, What happened? Sarah was slicing apples. Does Frank usually handle household supplies? Sometimes. Does he sell cattle without Caleb's signature? Rebecca looked up. No. Sarah set down the knife. 3 are missing from the June book. Rebecca's face changed. Are you certain? Yes. Could Caleb have authorized it before leaving? He could have. But there would be a note. Rebecca looked toward the window. Frank was crossing the yard toward the barn. He's been with Caleb 11 years. Sarah wiped apple juice from the blade with a cloth. That makes him trusted. Yes, it doesn't make him honest. Rebecca said nothing. Sarah went back to cutting apples. 2 days later, she had to go into Dry Creek for lamp oil and quinine. George drove her. The road was dry again after a week of hard sun. Cottonwood leaves flashed silver green in the wind. A hawk circled above the ridge. Sarah wore her plain brown town dress. Rebecca had offered her a better shawl. Sarah refused. No point dressing up to buy kerosene. George grinned. That sounds like something Caleb would say. Sarah glanced at him. You compare everyone to him? No. You've done it twice. George coughed, then looked very interested in the reins. Dry Creek was busier than Sarah remembered. A freight wagon stood outside the mercantile, Two cowboys were drinking coffee at a small lunch counter beside the hotel. Women moved between the butcher and the dry goods store with baskets over their arms. Sarah went first to Bennett's. She bought lamp oil, salt, a bottle of quinine, thread, coffee. Mr. Bennett wrote each item on a narrow receipt and sanded the ink before handing it over. Sarah checked the total. Habit, always. $3.12, he said. That's right. A woman near the ribbon counter laughed softly. Sarah did not look over at first. Then she heard her own name. Parker. Another woman answered. The one at Morgan's? Sarah kept folding the receipt. Yes. Staying right in the house, they say. While Caleb's away? Apparently. A pause. Then the first woman said, Well, I suppose if a woman can't get invited in, she can always make herself useful. A second laugh. Sarah put the receipt into her reticule. George had gone outside to load the oil. She could leave. That would be easiest. Instead, Sarah turned. 3 women stood near the fabric bolts, well-dressed, clean gloves, good hats. One of them, a narrow-faced blonde, looked directly at Sarah and did not pretend innocence. Sarah smiled. Morning. The blonde's expression shifted. Morning. Sarah stepped to the counter beside them and picked up a spool of blue thread. You were saying something about Caleb Morgan's house. The woman glanced at her companions. Nothing worth repeating. Then it probably wasn't worth saying. The room went quiet. Mr. Bennett looked down very suddenly at his account book. The blonde flushed. Sarah paid for the thread. Then she walked out. She did not hurry, that mattered. Outside, she stood beside the buckboard while George tied down the oil cans. He took one look at her face. What happened? Nothing. That kind of nothing? Sarah climbed onto the seat. George did not ask again. On the way home, they stopped beside a spring to water the team. Sarah walked a little way off the road. She stood beneath a cottonwood and pressed her hands against the rough bark. Not because the women had said anything new. That was the trouble. Sarah had heard versions of it since girlhood. Too large, too plain, useful, dependable, good in a kitchen, good with children. The sort of woman people remembered when work needed doing. Not the sort men crossed a room to choose. She closed her eyes, then opened them. 3 breaths. That was all she allowed herself. When she returned to the wagon, George handed her a tin cup of water. She drank. Neither spoke. By late afternoon, the Morgan ranch came into view. Emily ran from the porch before the wheels stopped. Sarah. Sarah barely had time to step down before the little girl wrapped both arms around her skirt. Something in Sarah's face changed. George saw it. He looked away. Inside, Rebecca was sitting upright with sewing in her lap. You were gone too long, she said. I was gone 4 hours. Exactly. Sarah put the quinine on the table. Terrible abandonment. Rebecca smiled. It felt good. Too good. That evening, Sarah went to the barn to ask George about the cattle book. Frank found her first. He was standing near the tack room sharpening a hoof knife against a stone. Slow strokes. Metal against stone. Sarah stopped several feet away. He looked up. Heard you went to town. I did. Folks talking? Folks always talk. Frank wiped the blade on a rag and folded it closed. Mrs. Morgan's walking again. Yes. Doctor says she's improving. Yes. Then your work's about finished. Sarah's eyes settled on him. So that's what this is. What? You telling me to leave? I'm saying there's no cause for you to linger. I decide when I leave. Not on another man's ranch. Sarah stepped closer. Not much. Enough. 3 steers. Frank's face went still. Again with that. Where did they go? I told you. Ranch business. And the flour? Ranch business. Coffee? Ranch business. Salt pork? His mouth tightened. Sarah continued. And why does Rebecca's cattle book show 6 head moved from the north pasture when George says only 3 were driven? Silence. A horse shifted inside a stall. Frank set the sharpening stone down. You've been asking questions. Yes. That can be an unhealthy habit. Sarah looked at him for a long moment. Then she turned toward the open barn door. Through it, she could see the house. Rebecca sat beside the window. Emily had fallen asleep against her side. Daniel was on the porch, working at a piece of wood. Frank spoke behind Sarah. This isn't your family. She stopped. He came a little closer. You came here for 3 days. You got paid. Mrs. Morgan's better. Those children belong to Caleb Morgan, not you. Sarah kept looking at the house. Emily's cheek rested against Rebecca's arm. The setting sun made the kitchen window glow. Sarah spoke without turning. Then somebody ought to start treating them like one. For once, Frank had no quick answer. Sarah walked away. That night, the ranch settled under a moonless sky. Rebecca slept. Emily slept beside her. Daniel had finally stopped whispering questions about whether coyotes could climb trees. Sarah lay on the settee with a blanket pulled to her waist. She could not sleep. Something from the barn bothered her, not Frank's warning. The books. 6 head moved, 3 recorded, 3 missing. She stared at the ceiling. Near midnight, a horse snorted outside. Sarah opened her eyes. Another horse answered. Then came the soft creak of leather. A gate chain. Hooves. More than one animal. Sarah sat up slowly. The sound moved across the yard, toward the lower trail. She went to the window and lifted the curtain by 1 inch. 3 riders were leaving the ranch. No lanterns. No conversation. One rode ahead. Even in the darkness, Sarah recognized the square set of his shoulders. Frank Turner. She watched until the riders disappeared beyond the cottonwoods. Then she looked toward the sleeping house behind her. The missing food suddenly seemed like the smallest part of what was wrong. By morning, the sky had changed. The blue had gone pale and hard over the bighorns, and a low bank of clouds pressed against the western peaks. The air smelled of pine sap and distant rain. George noticed it while filling the horse trough. Storm coming. Sarah stood beside the pump with a bucket in each hand. How soon? Could be noon. Could be dark. That useful. George looked at the mountains. About as useful as mountain weather ever gets. Sarah carried the buckets inside. She did not mention the riders. Not yet. She wanted to know whether Frank had returned. At breakfast, his chair in the bunkhouse was apparently occupied. George had seen his horse tied outside just before daylight. That meant Frank had ridden somewhere for several hours, returned before dawn, and expected nobody to ask why. Sarah asked anyway. She found him near the south corral checking a bay gelding's hoof. Late night? Frank did not look up, couldn't sleep. So you took 2 men riding? The hoof came down. Frank straightened slowly. You watched the yard after midnight. I heard horses. Strays broke fence. Which fence? West. George checked west yesterday. Frank's face remained calm. Then George missed something. Sarah glanced toward the pasture. Did you find the strays? Yes. How many? His eyes met hers. Enough. Sarah nodded once, then walked away. She could feel him watching until she reached the house. Rebecca was sitting at the kitchen table, wrapped in a gray shawl. You're picking at him. I'm asking questions. With Frank, those may be the same thing. Sarah poured coffee into a thick white mug. Do you trust him? Rebecca stared into her tea. I used to. Sarah stopped. That was different. Rebecca rubbed one thumb against the cup handle. 2 weeks before I got sick, I heard him arguing behind the tack room. With whom? I don't know. A man from town, I think. They stopped when I came outside. What were they saying? Something about brands. Sarah sat across from her. Why didn't you tell me? Because I wasn't sure what I heard. And now? Rebecca looked toward the window. Now I'm not sure I want to be right. Thunder rolled far beyond the mountains. Both women turned. The first rain arrived after noon. Not heavy, just scattered drops tapping the porch roof and darkening circles in the dust. By 2 o'clock, the wind had risen. Sarah brought the laundry in. George moved tools under cover. The ranch hands tied loose gates and checked the barn roof. Daniel wanted to help with everything. Sarah sent him inside twice. The third time, he disappeared before she could. She noticed 20 minutes later. Daniel? No answer. Emily was at the kitchen table drawing horses with a piece of charcoal. Where's your brother? Emily shrugged. He said he saw somebody. Sarah stopped. What somebody? A rider. Where? Emily pointed toward the creek. Sarah was already at the door. Rebecca called after her. Sarah? Stay inside. She crossed the yard quickly. Rain struck harder now. The creek lay below the ranch, normally shallow enough for a wagon to cross at the packed earth ford. Irrigation ditches branched from it toward the lower pasture through a wooden gate upstream. Sarah reached the barn. George! He came out carrying a coil of rope. What? Daniel's gone toward the creek. George dropped what he was doing. They ran. The wind drove rain sideways across the meadow. Sarah's skirt caught around her boots, and she gathered it in one hand. Daniel! Nothing. Then they heard the water. Not the usual creak, a roar. They crested the low rise. Sarah stopped dead. The creek had swollen twice its normal width. Brown water rushed across the ford carrying sticks, brush, and pieces of fence rail. George stared upstream. That ain't right. Sarah saw it. The irrigation gate. Wide open. Would the storm do that? No. Could it break? Not open clean like that. Then a voice came through the rain. Sarah! Her whole body turned. Daniel stood on the far side of the flooded crossing. Water had cut around him and turned a strip of high ground into a narrow island. He was clutching an old fence post with both arms. Don't move! Sarah shouted. I can't! George looked downstream. We need more men. There isn't time. A section of bank collapsed 10 yards from Daniel. The boy screamed. Sarah grabbed George's rope. What are you doing? Getting him. You'll both wash away. Then don't let me. Sarah. She looked at him. George. Something in her voice ended the argument. He unwound the rope. Sarah tied one end around the thick cottonwood nearest the crossing. George checked it himself, then took hold behind her. Keep upstream of the boy. Current'll push you down. Sarah nodded. She stepped into the water. Cold hit first, then force. By the third step, muddy water was above her knees. Sarah planted both feet before moving again. One step. Pause. Another. The current shoved against her skirt. She nearly turned sideways. George tightened the rope. Slow, I know. Daniel was crying now. Not loudly. Just frightened little sounds she could barely hear above the water. Look at me, Sarah called. He did. That's it. Not the water. Me. She moved again. The water reached her thighs. Her boots slid over stones. Sarah's size, mocked in dining rooms and boarding houses and dry goods stores, became something else here. Weight. Balance. A body that stayed where the river wanted it gone. She leaned against the current. Another step. Another. When she reached Daniel, his fingers had gone pale around the post. I'm scared. I know. I'm sorry. For what? I followed him. Who? The rider. Later. Sarah looped the second length of rope around his waist. Listen to me. George is going to pull. I'm staying with you, Daniel shook his head. I can't. Yes, you can. What if I fall? Then I catch you. He stared at her. Sarah held his face between both wet hands. You understand? A small nod. Good. Now hold me. Daniel wrapped his arms around her. Sarah raised one hand. George! The rope tightened. They moved. Halfway back, Daniel's foot slipped. His body dropped sideways. Sarah caught him against her chest and went to one knee. The current struck her shoulder. For one terrible second, both of them shifted downstream. George shouted. Another ranch hand appeared behind him and seized the rope. Sarah got her boot under herself. She stood. Pull! They came through the final yards together. George caught Daniel first, then Sarah. She stumbled onto the muddy bank and sat hard in the grass. Daniel clung to her. She wrapped both arms around him. Nobody spoke for several seconds. Only rain. Only water. Only Daniel's breathing against her neck. Then Sarah pulled back. Are you hurt? He shook his head. Anything hurt? No. She touched his forehead. His hands. His ribs. Good. George removed his coat and wrapped it around the boy. Sarah looked upstream. The gate stood open. Not broken. Open. Daniel, he looked at her. You said you followed a rider. He nodded. Who? I didn't see his face. What did you see? He came from the barn. George crouched beside him. When? After dinner yesterday. Then again today. Sarah felt something cold that had nothing to do with rain. What was he doing at the gate? Daniel swallowed. I thought he was fixing it. They brought him home. Rebecca met them on the porch despite Sarah's order to stay inside. The moment she saw Daniel soaked inside George's coat, her hand flew to her mouth. Daniel. He ran to her. Rebecca dropped to her knees and gathered him against her. Her coughing started almost immediately. Sarah reached them and put a hand beneath Rebecca's elbow. Inside. Rebecca did not argue. Sarah got both mother and son near the stove. Emily began crying when she understood what had happened. Daniel reached for her. I'm fine. Sarah changed into a dry dress. Then she came back and made hot milk with a little molasses. Her hands shook while she stirred, only then. Only after everybody was safe. She gripped the spoon until it stopped. A knock came at the back door. Frank entered without waiting. Rain glistened on his coat shoulders. I heard the boy had trouble. Sarah turned. Frank looked toward Daniel. For an instant, something crossed his face. Not surprise. not relief. Calculation. It vanished so quickly that another person might have missed it. Sarah did not. Gate came open, George said. Frank removed his gloves. Storm probably shook it loose. No, Sarah said. He looked at her. The latch was lifted. Frank's eyes rested on hers. You an irrigation expert now? No. Sarah set the spoon down. But George is. George stood near the stove. Frank glanced at him. George said nothing. That silence answered enough. Sarah crossed the kitchen. She stopped several feet from Frank. Daniel saw someone at that gate. Rebecca looked up sharply. Frank's expression remained almost bored. Children see all kinds of things. He followed a rider from this ranch. Did he identify him? No. Then there it is. Sarah stared at him. Frank put his gloves into his coat pocket. You're tired, Miss Parker. Nearly got yourself drowned. Don't turn an accident into a conspiracy because you've been staring at account books too long. He tipped his hat toward Rebecca. Glad the boy's safe. Then he walked outside. Sarah followed as far as the porch. Frank crossed the yard toward the barn. Halfway there, he looked back. Just once. Their eyes met through the rain. And Sarah knew. She could not prove he had opened that gate. She could not prove the midnight riders were connected to the missing cattle. But she knew one thing. Frank Turner was no longer merely a dishonest foreman worried about being caught stealing. Someone had put a child in danger. Sarah went back inside and closed the door. Then she slid the bolt. 2 days passed. The storm cleared. The creek dropped. Daniel developed no fever, though Rebecca checked him every hour the first night. Sarah began keeping Caleb's shotgun beside the kitchen door. George did not question it. On the second evening, the western sky burned copper behind the bighorns. Sarah was rolling biscuit dough when Buck's hooves sounded beyond the north gate. She froze. Not because she knew the horse, because every ranch dog in the yard suddenly began barking. George stepped from the barn. Daniel ran to the window. A rider came through the gate. Huge. Broad enough in the shoulders to make the saddle beneath him look small. Long coat powdered with trail dust. Hat pulled low. He rode like a man who had been riding for weeks and intended to stop only because he had reached the place he owned. Sarah wiped flour from her hands. She picked up the shotgun. Then she walked onto the porch. The giant cowboy looked at her. Sarah looked back. Neither of them knew it yet, but almost everything that mattered in both their lives was standing inside that house behind her. Caleb Morgan dismounted slowly. Sarah kept the shotgun where it was. His eyes went from the barrel to her face, then past her toward the open doorway. Who are you? Sarah Parker? That tells me your name. It's a start. He looked tired enough to drop where he stood, but there was nothing loose about the way he carried himself. Even after 5 weeks on the trail, he seemed built around some inner post that refused to bend. Sarah understood immediately why people called him Giant Morgan. He was enormous, not fat, not clumsy, just large in every direction that mattered. Shoulders made for lifting gates, hands that could probably close around a fence post, long legs dusted almost white from the road. Caleb took off his hat. You're holding my shotgun. Yes. Why? Because I didn't know who you were. You do now. I know what you said your name is. His eyes narrowed. Sarah did not lower the gun. Then Daniel came flying past her. The rest unfolded almost exactly as it had in the first stunned moments of Caleb's return. Uncle Caleb! The boy wrapped both arms around him. Sarah saw Caleb's hand settle on Daniel's head, saw the way his whole face changed when he noticed the bruise. Not much, but enough. Then Daniel said it. She saved Mama. Sarah wished he had not. Caleb looked at Rebecca. Rebecca looked back. There was too much history in the silence between them for Sarah to understand, but she could feel the weight of it. When Rebecca finally said, "Come inside," Caleb obeyed. That surprised Sarah more than anything else. She put the shotgun beside the kitchen door. Caleb noticed where she placed it. Of course he did. He seemed like a man who noticed where everything was. He stood just inside the kitchen while Rebecca lowered herself into a chair. Daniel hovered beside him. Emily stayed close to Sarah. Caleb looked around the room. The patched curtain, the medicine bottles, the bread, the clean stove. His gaze stopped at the white enamel basin beside the back door, then at the folded blankets. He was taking inventory. Sarah recognized the habit. She did it too. What happened? Rebecca started with the illness. Sarah remained quiet. This was not her family story to tell. Not yet. Rebecca described the fever, the doctor, George riding into Dry Creek, the days she barely remembered. Caleb looked toward Sarah once. She was slicing biscuit dough with the rim of a tin cup. His gaze stayed there half a second too long. Sarah noticed. She kept cutting. Then Rebecca came to the flood. Caleb stopped breathing for what felt like a moment. Daniel went where? The creek, Rebecca said. Why? He followed someone. Caleb looked at Daniel. The boy stared at the floor. I thought he was fixing the gate. Who? I don't know. Caleb's jaw hardened. Sarah set the cup down. The irrigation gate was opened. Caleb turned toward her. Opened? Not broken. You saw it? Yes. George? Confirmed it. Caleb looked toward the window. Frank's quarters were dark. Where is Turner? Nobody has seen him since this afternoon. That was not exactly true. Sarah had seen him once, crossing the far pasture before sundown, but she had not seen him return. Caleb faced her again. What makes you think Frank had anything to do with it? Sarah folded the dough over once. I didn't say he did. You were thinking it. Yes. Rebecca leaned back in the chair. Sarah found shortages. Caleb glanced at her. What shortages? Pantry first. Sarah wiped flour from her fingers and went to the desk. She brought back Rebecca's household ledger and laid it on the table. Caleb sat. The chair looked too small under him. Sarah turned the pages. 20 pounds of flour unaccounted for. Coffee, salt pork, beans, kerosene. Caleb studied the entries. Could have been moved to the bunkhouse. It wasn't. You checked? Yes. Caleb looked at her. Sarah held the look. Something passed between them. Not warmth. Not trust. Recognition, perhaps. Two people who did not enjoy being answered carelessly. Rebecca said, There's more. Sarah opened the cattle pages. 3 steers missing from the June record. Caleb bent closer. His finger moved down the column. Not 3. Sarah frowned. He turned the book around. These marks here. She leaned over the table. Caleb's hand stopped beside a set of short notations she had taken for feed entries. They're pasture transfers. Sarah looked at him. How many? 6 head moved north. That's what the book says. That's not what happened. How do you know? Because I moved 12 before I left. He stood. The chair legs scraped hard across the floor. Emily jumped. Caleb immediately stopped. He looked at the child, then lowered his voice. I need to check something. Rebecca said. Tonight? Yes. You just rode in, I'm aware. Sarah crossed her arms. So are the horses. Caleb turned. What? Your horse is spent. He's fine. He carried you 5 weeks. He's used to work. So are you. Rebecca covered her mouth. Sarah could not tell whether she was coughing or hiding a smile. Caleb looked at Sarah for a long moment. I don't recall asking. No. Sarah returned to the dough. You don't seem to do much of that. Daniel stared at her, then at Caleb. Rebecca finally did smile. Caleb did not. But the corner of his mouth threatened him again. This time Sarah saw it. He took off his coat. Fine. He hung it over the chair. Sarah looked at it, then at the peg behind him. Caleb followed her eyes. Without a word, he moved the coat to the peg. Rebecca's smile widened. Sarah turned away before he caught hers. Supper was quiet, not uncomfortable, just careful. Caleb ate like a man who had spent weeks living on trail beans and salt meat. Sarah noticed he finished the biscuits first. She put another one on his plate. He looked at it, then at her. I didn't ask. I know. He ate it anyway. After supper, Caleb went to the barn. Sarah expected him to be gone half an hour. He returned in 10 minutes. His face had changed. Rebecca saw it immediately. What? Caleb shut the door. Frank's tack is gone. Sarah stood. What else? 2 saddles. George came in behind him. And 4 head from the east pen. Caleb looked at George. You count twice? 3 times. Sarah went still. Caleb crossed to the cattle ledger again. He opened it, ran one finger down the entries, then looked towards Sarah. You said you thought 3 steers were missing. That's what I could prove. It's more. How much more? Caleb did not answer right away. He turned pages. Dates, brand marks, transfers, feed totals. George stepped closer. Caleb tapped one entry. This one was changed. Sarah leaned in. She saw the scrape in the paper, same as before. Caleb turned another page, and this, another, and this. Rebecca's hand went to her throat. How many? Caleb sat down slowly. At least 30 head. George swore under his breath. Sarah's eyes moved to Caleb. 30 head was not a little theft. Not one dishonest man slipping food from a pantry. Not even a foreman taking advantage of an absent owner. Caleb seemed to reach the same conclusion. He couldn't move that many alone. Sarah said, So Frank has help. Caleb looked toward the dark window. More than help. The kitchen became very still. Daniel and Emily had been sent to bed, but Sarah could hear floorboards creak in the hall. Caleb lowered his voice. 30 head means buyers. Off the books? Yes. Altered brands? Maybe. George said, If he's been switching marks, he'd need somebody downstream to take them. Caleb nodded. Somebody willing to buy cattle they know aren't clean. Sarah watched him. He no longer looked tired. The trail had disappeared from his face. This was something else now. Work. Danger. A problem he could put both hands around. She understood that too. Rebecca asked, What do we do? Caleb closed the ledger. We don't do anything tonight. Sarah looked at him. He met her eyes. Tomorrow, I start with the brands. There was a pause. Then he added, And nobody leaves this house alone. Sarah's chin lifted. I can take care of myself. I noticed. The words were plain, but this time there was no challenge in them. Only fact. Sarah looked down first. Caleb carried the ledger to the high shelf above the desk. When he turned back, his eyes found her again. He had come home expecting an empty house. Instead, he had found a stranger guarding his sister, his nephew, his niece, his accounts, and perhaps the edge of something much larger than simple theft. And for the first time that evening, Caleb Morgan did not look at Sarah Parker as though she were someone who had wandered into his life. He looked at her as though she might already be standing in the middle of it. By breakfast, Sarah had decided she should leave. Caleb was home. Rebecca was stronger. Daniel was eating. Emily had stopped waking at night whenever her mother coughed. The danger around Frank Turner was serious, but it belonged to Caleb now. At least that was what Sarah told herself while folding her blue dress into the trunk. Emily stood in the doorway watching. You're packing? Yes. Why? Because your uncle is home. Emily frowned as though those two facts had nothing to do with each other. Sarah folded a chemise. Your mother doesn't need me the way she did. Emily came into the room. She still likes you. Sarah stopped. The little girl looked up at her. So do I. Sarah smoothed the dress flat. That isn't the same thing. Emily seemed ready to argue, but Rebecca called from the kitchen. Sarah closed the trunk. For now. Caleb spent most of that morning outside. He and George checked branding records against the east pasture. They rode the lower fence line. They opened every tack box Frank used and found 2 sets of receipts that did not match the entries in the ranch ledger. By noon, Caleb had learned enough to make his expression colder each time he came back through the yard. Sarah watched from the kitchen window. He worked without wasted motion. No dramatic anger. No cursing. That made him more intimidating. A man who shouted might exhaust himself. Caleb Morgan seemed to store anger where other people stored breath. Rebecca noticed Sarah watching. You know the glass works both ways. Sarah stepped back from the window. I was looking at the weather. Of course, it may rain again. Clear sky. Mountain weather changes. Rebecca smiled into her coffee. Sarah ignored her. Caleb entered 10 minutes later carrying a small stack of receipts. Dust covered his boots. He looked at Sarah's trunk beside the hall. You going somewhere? I was planning to, Rebecca said. She was. Sarah gave her a look. Caleb set the receipts on the table. Not yet. Sarah stared at him. He seemed to hear the problem only after the words had left his mouth. I mean, I know what you mean. No, I don't think you do. That makes 2 of us. Rebecca pushed her chair back. I think I'll rest. You just sat down, Sarah said. I'm suddenly exhausted. She disappeared toward her room. Caleb remained beside the table. Sarah crossed her arms. You don't get to tell me I can't leave. I know. Do you? Yes. He looked genuinely uncomfortable. That surprised her enough to keep her quiet. Caleb glanced toward the yard. Frank's still out there somewhere. I'm aware. Until I know who he's working with, I'd rather you stay here. You'd rather? Yes. That sounds different. His mouth moved slightly. I'm learning. Sarah looked at him for another moment. Then she turned toward the stove. My trunk stays until Rebecca is fully steady. Caleb nodded. And until this business with Frank is settled. Another nod. That doesn't mean I'm your responsibility. His answer came after a pause. I know that too. For the next several days, they learned each other in pieces. Caleb discovered Sarah drank coffee strong enough to stain a spoon. Sarah discovered Caleb always checked the barn latch twice before bed. He learned she hummed when kneading bread, but stopped the moment she realized anyone could hear. She learned he spoke to horses more gently than he spoke to people. He found that Sarah could judge when biscuits were done by smell before opening the oven. She found that Caleb repaired broken tools immediately, but ignored torn shirts until the sleeves nearly separated. Nothing important happened. That was what made it dangerous. One afternoon, Sarah brought wildflowers in from the creek bank. Small yellow blossoms, a few sprigs of purple. She put them in an old brown bottle and set them on the narrow table beneath a framed photograph in the parlor. Laura Morgan. Sarah had learned the name from Rebecca, Caleb's wife. The photograph showed a slender woman seated beside Caleb, though he looked younger there, less guarded. Laura's hand rested lightly on his forearm. He was almost smiling. Sarah did not ask how she died. Not then. She simply set the flowers down. Caleb found them after supper. Sarah was wiping the kitchen table when his voice came from the parlor. "Who put these here?" Something in the tone made her go still. She walked into the room. Caleb stood beside the photograph holding the bottle. "I did." "Why?" Sarah looked at the flowers. "I thought they were pretty." "Why there?" His voice was not loud, but it had changed. Closed. Sarah understood before he explained. She stepped forward. "I wasn't trying to move anything. You changed the table. I put flowers on it. It was fine before." Sarah's face warmed, not from embarrassment, from anger. Then she looked at the photograph, at Laura, at Caleb's hand holding the bottle too tightly. The anger went out of her. She reached for the flowers. "I wasn't trying to take her place." Caleb looked at her. Sarah lifted the bottle from his hand. "I only thought somebody should remember she lived here." He said nothing. Sarah turned toward the kitchen. Behind her came his voice. She liked yellow. Sarah stopped. Caleb was looking at the photograph now. Laura. She liked yellow flowers. Sarah waited. He rubbed one thumb against the edge of the frame. "I haven't put any there in years." Sarah slowly returned the bottle to the table. Caleb did not object. Neither spoke again. The next morning, Sarah found a small bunch of yellow flowers on the kitchen windowsill. No note, no explanation. Caleb was already in the barn. Sarah touched one petal with the tip of her finger. Then she made breakfast. Later that afternoon, a supply wagon arrived from Dry Creek. Flour, meal, coffee, soap, lamp oil. Caleb checked the receipt beside the driver. Sarah stood near the pantry as George unloaded sacks. She reached for a 50-pound flour sack. A large hand closed around the other end. Sarah looked up. "Caleb." "I've got it." "So do I. I can carry flour, I know." He lifted the sack as though it weighed nothing. Sarah held on. "Caleb?" He stopped. They stood facing each other with the flour sack between them. "I said I can carry it." "I heard you." "Then let go." Instead, he said quietly, "I know you can. That doesn't mean you should have to carry everything alone." Sarah's fingers loosened, not because he was stronger, because for 1 second she did not know what to say. That happened rarely. Caleb took the sack into the pantry. Sarah remained where she was. George passed carrying a box of soap. He looked at her. She gave him such a sharp look that he immediately found somewhere else to look. That evening, the ranch settled early. The sky had turned deep blue behind the mountains. Sarah went outside after supper because the house felt too warm. She walked past the barn, past the well, then farther toward the cottonwoods. That was where she saw him. Caleb sat alone on the grass beneath a small rise overlooking the creek. Two grave markers stood there, one larger, one smaller. Sarah stopped. She understood. Laura. And someone else. She nearly turned back. Caleb spoke without looking at her. You don't have to leave. Sarah stood still. I wasn't sure whether I should stay. He looked toward the smaller marker. My son. The words were simple. Sarah's breath caught. She said nothing. Caleb pulled one knee up and rested his forearm over it, 7 months old. Sarah looked at the little stone. I'm sorry. He nodded. No thanks. No explanation. Sarah walked closer. Not too close. She sat in the grass several feet away. For a while there was only the creek, the evening insects, the distant knock of a horse against a stall. Caleb did not ask why she stayed. Sarah did not ask him to talk. The space between them remained open, quiet. And for the first time in years, Caleb Morgan sat beside those graves with another person nearby and did not feel the need to leave first. After that evening, nothing between them was spoken of. That seemed to matter more than if it had been. Sarah did not ask Caleb about Laura again. Caleb did not ask Sarah why she had stayed beside him until the last light disappeared behind the cottonwoods. The next morning, he left a fresh split of firewood beside the kitchen door before dawn. Sarah found it when she came out carrying the ash bucket. She looked toward the barn. Caleb was tightening a saddle strap. He did not look up. Sarah carried the wood inside. That was how it went. Small things. Caleb began coming to supper instead of eating later in the bunkhouse or carrying a plate to his study. At first he sat at the end of the table and spoke only when somebody asked him something. Daniel made certain that happened often. Uncle Caleb, how many steers can one man rope in a day? Depends on the man. Could you rope 20? If they were foolish enough to stand still. Daniel grinned. Emily asked whether Buck slept standing up. Caleb explained that horses could doze on their feet, but usually lay down when they felt safe. Emily thought about that. Then she asked, Do you? Rebecca nearly choked on her coffee. Sarah lowered her eyes to her plate. Caleb stared at his niece. No. Emily accepted the answer. Sarah did not look up until she was certain her smile had passed. 3 days later, Caleb asked Sarah to ride with him. She was kneading biscuit dough. Where? Lower pasture. Why? I want another pair of eyes. Sarah wiped flour from her hands. George has eyes. He does. Rebecca has eyes. Rebecca isn't riding yet. Sarah narrowed hers. Caleb waited. You think I missed something? No. Then why me? Because you noticed things before I did. That answer stopped her. Sarah turned toward Rebecca. Rebecca was sewing at the table. She did not lift her head. Don't involve me. Sarah changed into an older skirt and borrowed a side-saddle mare named Daisy. Caleb adjusted the stirrup without comment. When Sarah mounted, he stepped back immediately, rather than steadying her longer than necessary. She noticed. They rode south along the creek. The grass had begun fading toward autumn gold. Cottonwood leaves rattled overhead. Farther west, the mountains rose blue and gray beneath a clear sky. Caleb showed her where Frank had claimed cattle were moved. Sarah looked at the trampled ground. Too few tracks. Caleb glanced over. You can tell? I worked for a stockman's widow before the boarding house. You never mentioned that. You never asked. His mouth shifted. Sarah smiled. They found a section of fence where the lower wire had been cut and twisted back together. Caleb dismounted. Sarah stayed in the saddle while he examined it. Recent? Within a month. Enough to move cattle through? If someone wanted to. Sarah looked toward the faint road leading east. Where does that go? Dry Creek eventually. There's a cattle trail that joins it near Miller's Crossing. Caleb stood. Frank had help. Sarah met his eyes. Yes. Neither said what came next. If Frank had buyers, the danger was larger than the ranch. On the ride home, Daisy stumbled once on loose stone. Sarah caught herself. Caleb's hand moved toward her reins, then stopped. You all right? Yes. He nodded. That was all. For some reason, Sarah thought about the restraint longer than she thought about the stumble. By the end of the week, Dry Creek's harvest social became unavoidable. Rebecca had been talking about it for days. You're coming. Sarah shook her head. I am not. You are. I own exactly 2 dresses fit to be seen in public, and one of them has flower permanently worked into the cuff. I have a green one. You are thinner than my left arm. Rebecca looked offended. That is an exaggeration. Not by much. Rebecca disappeared into her room. She returned carrying dark green wool. I altered it. Sarah stared. You altered your dress? I altered an old one of mine. For me? Yes. When? When you were busy pretending not to watch Caleb from the kitchen window. Sarah took the dress from her. I do not do that. Rebecca smiled. Of course. The dress fit better than Sarah expected. Rebecca had let out the waist and added panels at the sides with darker cloth from an older skirt. It did not hide Sarah's figure. That would have been impossible. Instead, it fit it. When Sarah stood before the small mirror in Rebecca's room, she hardly recognized the woman looking back. Not because she looked younger, not because she looked smaller, because the dress did not apologize for her. Rebecca pinned Sarah's brown hair back loosely. Done. Sarah touched one curl near her cheek. This is foolish. Probably. I don't know why I agreed. I do. Sarah looked at her. Rebecca only smiled. The social was held in the upstairs hall above Bennett's Mercantile. Lanterns hung along the walls. A fiddle and guitar played near the windows. Tables were covered with pies, pickles, biscuits, cakes, coffee, and jars of preserves brought in from ranches for miles around. The room smelled of beeswax, wool, coffee, and cinnamon. Sarah knew she had made a mistake the moment she entered. Conversation changed. Not stopped. Changed. That was worse. She heard a woman whisper, "That's her." Another answered, "Morgan's cook?" Sarah kept walking. Rebecca took Emily toward the refreshment table. Daniel vanished with 3 boys near the stairs. Sarah stayed beside the wall. Across the room stood Caleb. He had cleaned up. That surprised her. His beard was trimmed. His dark coat was brushed. A clean white shirt showed at the collar. He looked no smaller indoors. If anything, the crowded room made his size more obvious. Several women stood near him. One was blonde. Sarah recognized her from the Mercantile. The woman laughed at something Caleb had not said. Sarah looked away. A fiddle tune ended. Another began. Couples moved onto the floor. Sarah picked up a cup of coffee. Miss Parker. She turned. The blonde woman from the Mercantile stood beside her. Evening. Evening. The woman's eyes moved over Sarah's dress. That's a lovely shade. Thank you. I suppose Mrs. Morgan lent it to you. Sarah held the coffee cup steady. She did. How kind. There it was. Not an insult. Almost worse. Sarah smiled. She's a kind woman. The blonde seemed disappointed. Across the room, Caleb saw them. Sarah knew because his expression changed. He excused himself from the men beside him. Then he crossed the hall. People noticed. That was the trouble with a man Caleb's size. He could not cross a room quietly, even when he made no sound. Sarah watched him come. He stopped in front of her. "Dance with me." Sarah blinked. "What?" "Dance, I heard you." "Good." She lowered her voice. "Caleb." He held out his hand. Sarah looked around. The blonde woman had gone very still. So had several others. People are staring. Caleb glanced once around the room. They've got eyes. Sarah looked at him. Let them use them. Something inside her shifted. Not enough to trust. Enough to move. She put her hand in his. His fingers closed carefully. He led her onto the floor. Caleb Morgan danced better than any man his size had a right to. Sarah discovered that within 30 seconds. "You practiced." "With Laura." The answer was quiet. Sarah looked up. His expression did not close. So she left it alone. They turned slowly beneath the lantern light. Caleb's hand rested at her waist. Not gripping. Not hesitant either. Sarah could feel the heat of it through the wool. She was aware of every eye in the room. Then, gradually, she was not. Caleb looked down at her. "You look different." Sarah raised an eyebrow. "That is a dangerous sentence. I meant the dress. Worse." He almost smiled. "You look good." The words came out plain, awkward, real. Sarah looked away before he could see how much they affected her. The fiddle changed tempo. Caleb adjusted with it. For one brief stretch of music, Sarah Parker forgot the mercantile women, forgot Frank, forgot missing cattle, forgot all the rooms where she had been valued for what she could lift, cook, mend, or clean. There was only Caleb's hand, the wood floor beneath her boots, and a giant cowboy who had crossed a crowded hall to choose her where everybody could see. When the dance ended, he did not immediately release her. Neither did she. Then applause began for the musicians. The moment broke. Later that night, they rode home under a cold moon. Rebecca and the children were in the wagon. Sarah rode Daisy. Caleb stayed close beside her. They spoke little. At the ranch, Sarah helped Emily out of her coat and tucked her into bed. Rebecca went to her room. Daniel fell asleep almost before removing his boots. Sarah walked toward the kitchen for water. Then she heard voices outside. "Caleb." "George." The window was open an inch. Sarah stopped without meaning to. George spoke first. "You sure about this?" "Yes." "And she knows?" "No." A pause. Then Caleb said, "I want her in Cheyenne until this is finished." Sarah's hand tightened around the empty cup. George lowered his voice. "She may not go. She will if I arrange the position properly." "Caleb, I have friends there. Good people. Boarding house near the depot needs a cook." Sarah stood completely still. The dance returned to her all at once. His hand at her waist. "You look good." The entire room watching. Then this. George sighed. "You ought to ask her." Caleb answered, "It's safer if I don't give her room to argue." Sarah looked down at the cup in her hand. Something that had opened inside her that evening closed quietly. She returned to her room. She did not cry. She took out her trunk, folded the green dress, packed both cast-iron pans. Before sunrise, when Caleb came into the kitchen for coffee, Sarah was waiting beside the table. Her coat was buttoned. Her trunk stood by the door. And for the first time since he had come home, she looked at him as though he were a stranger again. Caleb stopped just inside the kitchen. The coffee pot hissed softly on the stove. Outside, the ranch was still dark except for a thin gray line behind the eastern hills. Somewhere in the barn, a horse kicked once against a stallboard. Sarah stood beside the table wearing her brown traveling dress. No green wool. No loose curl beside her cheek. No softness left from the dance. Caleb looked at the trunk. Then at her. "You heard me." "Yes." His jaw tightened. "How much?" "Enough." Sarah lifted her coat from the chair. Caleb stepped forward. "Sarah." "No." The word was quiet. That made him stop. She put on the coat and fastened the first button. "You don't get to explain this as though I misunderstood. I was trying to keep you safe, by arranging my life behind my back. Frank isn't alone." "I know. He's selling stolen cattle through men outside Dry Creek." "I know. One of those men may have helped with the creek gate." "I know that too." Caleb spread one hand on the table. "Then you understand why I want you gone until this is finished." Sarah stared at him. There it was. Not ask. Want. Gone. She looked down at the button beneath her fingers and pushed it through the wrong hole. She undid it and tried again. When she spoke, her voice was still controlled. "I came here for 3 days." Caleb said nothing. "I stayed because Rebecca couldn't breathe without coughing until she was blue around the lips. I stayed because Daniel was giving Emily half his breakfast. I stayed because your pantry was empty when it should have been full. I know what you did." "No." "You know the results." Her eyes lifted to his. "You came home and found everyone alive." Caleb went still. Sarah continued. "You didn't see Rebecca shaking so hard I had to hold the cup against her mouth. You didn't hear Emily crying into a blanket because she thought her mother was dying. You weren't standing in that creek when Daniel lost his footing." His face hardened. Not at her. At himself, Sarah saw it. For a moment, she almost stopped. Then she remembered the open window. Cheyenne. Good people. A position arranged properly. No room to argue. She kept going. "I crossed floodwater for your nephew. I slept 3 feet from your sister's door because I was afraid I wouldn't hear her if her breathing changed. I stood in your pantry counting stolen food. I stood in your barn while Frank Turner told me I had no business asking questions." "I know. And when you needed someone to ride beside you and look at those cut fences, you asked me." "Yes." "When you wanted someone sitting beside your family at supper, you let me stay." Caleb's eyes dropped briefly. Sarah's throat tightened. "But when the choice became mine, you made it for me. I'm trying to make sure you live long enough to be angry about it." The sentence came out rougher than anything he had said. Sarah flinched, not because she feared him, because beneath the words, she heard the thing he had not said. Laura. His son. Loss. Caleb stepped closer. "If Frank knows you've been checking books, then you're part of this whether you wanted to be or not." "I know. Cheyenne puts distance between you and the men he works with, and between me and everyone here, for a little while. You don't know that." "No." "Then stop talking like you do." Silence. The coffee boiled over. Neither moved. A thin stream ran down the side of the pot and hissed on the stove lid. Sarah looked toward it. Caleb reached past her and moved the pot off the heat. Such an ordinary motion. Careful. Automatic. It made her angrier. She stepped back. You trust me to save the people you love. Caleb looked at her. But not enough to let me decide whether I stay beside them. His hand remained on the coffee pot. Sarah waited. 1 second. 2. 3. He could have said she was wrong. He could have asked her to stay. He could have said anything. He did not. And that silence told her more than the conversation outside the window had. Sarah nodded once. All right. Caleb's brow drew together. Sarah. No. You've said what you mean. I haven't. Then say it. He looked at her. She waited. His mouth opened, closed. Sarah gave him another second. Nothing came. She picked up the handle of her trunk. Caleb reached for it. She pulled it away. No. It's heavy, I know. His hand fell. That hurt worse than if he had argued. Sarah carried the trunk toward the door. Rebecca appeared in the hallway in her nightdress and shawl. What is happening? Sarah stopped. Rebecca saw the trunk. Then Caleb. Her face changed. Oh, Caleb. He looked away. Sarah forced a small smile. I was going to leave eventually. Not like this. No. Rebecca came closer. You don't have to go. Sarah swallowed. I do. Emily appeared behind her mother, rubbing one eye. Sarah? Sarah closed her eyes for the briefest moment. Then she crouched. Emily immediately wrapped both arms around her neck. Sarah held her. Tight, but not long enough to make leaving impossible. I need you to help your mama. Emily shook her head. George will take good care of everybody. Another shake. Sarah kissed her hair. Daniel stood farther down the hall. He did not cry. That was somehow harder. Are you mad at us? Yes, he asked. Sarah stood. No. At Uncle Caleb? Caleb's head lifted. Sarah looked at him, then back at Daniel. I'm mad at a decision. Daniel considered that. His? Sarah almost laughed. Go put your boots on. He did. George drove Sarah into Dry Creek just after 7. Caleb watched from the porch. He did not stop her. Sarah did not look back until the ranch house disappeared behind cottonwoods. Then she looked once. Only once. George kept his eyes on the road. After several miles, he said, Cheyenne? Sarah stared at the hills ahead. No. That what Caleb arranged? Yes. You going? No. George nodded slowly. Where then? I'll take the morning stage east as far as Casper. I know people there. George adjusted the reins. You sure? Sarah's mouth tightened. No. It was the first completely honest answer she had given all morning. By noon, her trunk sat inside the Dry Creek Hotel beside the same narrow stairway she had climbed weeks earlier. Mrs. Bennett gave her a room for the night. Sarah paid in advance. She put the receipt in her reticule. Habit. Always. Then she sat on the edge of the bed without removing her coat. The room felt smaller than she remembered. At the Morgan Ranch, supper came at 6. Caleb sat at the end of the table. Rebecca served stew. Daniel pushed carrots around his bowl. Emily did not eat at all. Nobody mentioned Sarah. That made her absence larger. Caleb looked at the stove. The fire was correct. The stew was hot. The bread was sliced. Everything worked. He had spent 4 years making certain everything worked. Fences repaired, cattle counted, bills paid, feed stored. A house did not have to be warm to function. He knew that better than anyone. After supper, Rebecca took the children to bed. Caleb remained in the kitchen. One chair stood empty. He looked at it longer than he meant to. Then he noticed Sarah's apron hanging behind the pantry door. White cotton. Flour dust still caught in one seam. He took it from the hook, held it in both hands. For a man his size, it seemed absurdly small. Footsteps came behind him. Emily. She stood in the doorway in her nightgown. Caleb lowered the apron. You should be asleep. She ignored that. Is Sarah coming back? Caleb looked at the cloth in his hands. I don't know. Emily stepped closer. Did she leave because we weren't her family? Something inside him shifted. No. But Frank said that. Caleb looked sharply at her. When? Before the river. Emily rubbed her bare foot against the floorboard. He told her this wasn't her family. Caleb's fingers tightened around the apron. And what did Sarah say? Emily thought carefully. She said somebody should treat us like one. Caleb looked toward the empty chair. Emily's voice grew smaller. Maybe nobody told her she was ours. He had no answer. Not one. The giant cowboy who could settle an angry herd, break ice from a winter trough, repair a gate in darkness, and stare down men twice as mean as they were smart, stood in his own kitchen holding Sarah Parker's apron and discovered there was no tool in the barn for what he had broken. Emily went back to bed. Caleb stayed. Outside, wind moved through the cottonwoods. The house was clean. The house was safe. The house was exactly as he had spent 4 years making it, and it had never felt emptier. Caleb did not sleep much that night. He tried. He lay down, stared at the ceiling, listened to the wind move along the eaves. At some point he got up, crossed the dark house, and stood in the kitchen again. Sarah's apron was still folded on the table. He had no idea why he had folded it. He picked it up, put it back down. By dawn, he had made a decision. Not a good one, not a safe one, but his. He saddled Buck before Rebecca came into the yard. She stood on the porch with her shawl around her shoulders. Where are you going? Dry Creek. For Sarah? Caleb tightened the cinch. Yes. Rebecca watched him. What are you going to say? He stopped. That was the problem. He had spent half the night trying to find words that did not sound like orders. Stay. Too small. I was wrong. True, but not enough. Come back. That sounded worse. Rebecca stepped down from the porch. Caleb. He looked at her. Ask her. His mouth tightened. I know, no, you keep saying that. She came closer. Ask her what she wants. Then listen. Caleb put one boot in the stirrup. I intend to. Rebecca nodded. That would be new. He gave her a look. She almost smiled. Then her face changed. Bring her home if she wants to come. Caleb mounted. If she doesn't? Rebecca looked at the house. Then you let her go. Those words followed him through the north gate. The road to Dry Creek ran east along the creek before cutting through a narrow stretch of pines. Morning frost silvered the grass in the shade. Buck's breath smoked faintly. Caleb rode harder than he usually did. Not reckless, just fast. He had covered perhaps 6 miles when Buck shied. Caleb pulled him up. A shape lay beside the road near a stand of juniper. At first he thought it was a fallen saddle. Then it moved. Caleb was off the horse before the man raised his head. George. George Harris sat crooked against a rock, one sleeve torn, dried blood at his temple. Caleb dropped to one knee. What happened? George tried to stand. Caleb put a hand against his shoulder. Don't. Ranch. What about it? Frank. Caleb's face went still. George swallowed. He came at me near Miller's Crossing. 2 men with him. Why? I was asking questions. About the cattle? George nodded. I found one of the buyers. Who? Silas Webb. Caleb knew the name. Cattle broker out of Johnson County. Not clean. Not openly dirty either. The kind of man who stayed one step to the side of every law he broke. George breathed shallowly. They knew I'd been talking. Frank hit me from behind. Caleb's hand tightened. Where are they? Headed back. Caleb looked toward the ranch. Why? George grabbed his sleeve. Rebecca. Everything in Caleb went cold. What about her? George forced himself upright. She heard more than she told us. Caleb stared at him. During the sickness, before Sarah came. George nodded. She heard Frank and Webb behind the tack room, heard Webb's name, heard him talking about rebranding and moving stock east. Caleb's jaw locked. She can identify him. That's what Frank figured out. The wind moved through the pines. Caleb rose. Can you ride? George tried to put weight on one leg. His face changed. Not far. Caleb looked toward Dry Creek, then back toward the ranch. He could ride straight home. He should. Every second mattered. But Sarah was in town, and if Frank had partners outside Dry Creek, she was not safe there either. Caleb made the decision fast. He helped George onto Buck. Take him toward the Miller place. What about you? I'm borrowing your horse. George nodded toward the sorrel tied farther down the road. Caleb. He turned. Don't waste time trying to say pretty things. Caleb looked at him. George gave a painful half-smile. Just tell her the truth. Caleb swung onto the sorrel. I was planning to. Lord help us. Dry Creek appeared just before 9. The stage stood outside the hotel. Sarah was beside it. Her trunk had already been strapped to the rear rack. She wore her brown coat and held one cast-iron pan wrapped in cloth beneath her arm. The driver was checking the wheel bolts. Caleb pulled the sorrel to a hard stop. Sarah turned. For 1 second, neither moved. Then she saw his face. The anger in hers changed. What happened? He dismounted. Frank's gone back to the ranch. Sarah's hand tightened around the pan. With who? 2 men. Why? Rebecca. Her face went pale. What about her? She heard one of them. During her illness. A buyer named Silas Webb. She can identify him. Sarah did not ask whether Caleb was certain. She turned immediately toward the stage. Untie my trunk. The driver looked confused. Ma'am? Untie it. Caleb stepped closer. Sarah. She looked at him. There isn't time. I know. You don't have to. Don't. Her voice stopped him. Not angry. Focused. Not now. Caleb nodded. That was fair. The driver finished loosening the trunk. Sarah set the wrapped pan on top, then looked at the sorrel. 1 horse? George has Buck. Where's George? Hurt. Alive. Sarah closed her eyes briefly, then gathered her skirts. Help me up. Caleb froze for half a beat. Not because he did not know how, because yesterday she had refused to let him carry her trunk. Now she was asking. He stepped closer. One hand at her elbow, the other at her waist. Careful. Sarah put one boot in the stirrup. Caleb lifted. She settled behind the saddle. There was nowhere else to sit. Her arms came around his middle. For one breath, neither moved. Caleb felt the weight of her against his back. Warm, solid, real. Sarah said, "Go." He did. They rode west hard. The town disappeared behind them. For the first 2 miles, neither spoke. Sarah kept both arms around Caleb because the sorrel was moving too fast to do otherwise. At the first rise, he slowed the horse to spare him. Sarah took the chance to breathe. "Daniel knows the barn better than Frank." Caleb glanced back. "What? If there's trouble, he'll hide there." "Probably. Emily will stay with Rebecca." "Yes." "George said Webb was with Frank?" "One of the men." Sarah's grip tightened. "Then Frank wasn't trying to scare me away." Caleb said nothing. She understood. He was protecting the cattle operation. "Yes." "And Rebecca is the witness." "Yes." Sarah looked past his shoulder toward the distant mountains. All those weeks, the food, the altered book, the gate. Daniel nearly drowning. It had never been about her. Not really. She had simply stepped into the path. Caleb felt her shift behind him. "You were right." Sarah's voice came flat. He almost laughed from the sheer wrongness of the timing. "About what?" "Cheyenne." He looked back as much as he could. "No. You were trying to keep me away from this. I was trying to decide for you." The answer surprised her. Caleb kept his eyes on the road. "You were right about that." Sarah said nothing. He continued. "I should have asked." The sorrel's hooves struck hard-packed earth. Sarah's cheek was close to his shoulder. "You came to Dry Creek to say that?" "Yes." "Only that?" Caleb hesitated. Sarah felt it. There were words in him, more than an apology. She knew it. He knew she knew it. But then the ranch came into view. No smoke. No movement in the yard. No lamp in the front window despite the morning chill. Sarah straightened. Caleb slowed the horse. Something stood beside the house. A wagon. Not theirs. Caleb's body changed beneath her hands. Every muscle went tight. Sarah looked toward the barn. The doors were shut. Too shut. The yard looked abandoned, but the wagon tracks were fresh. Caleb turned the sorrel off the main road and into the trees. "We go the rest on foot." Sarah nodded. He helped her down. This time neither commented on the touch. Caleb tied the horse behind a screen of pines. Sarah looked toward the house, then toward the barn. "Daniel," she whispered. Caleb followed her eyes. A movement. High in the loft. Tiny. Gone. He looked at Sarah. She had seen it too. Daniel was alive. For the first time since leaving Dry Creek, Caleb let himself take one full breath. Then the front door opened. Frank Turner stepped out. Behind him came Silas Webb, and between them, Rebecca Morgan walked slowly toward the wagon with Emily pressed against her side. A third man stood near the rear wheel. He was younger than Frank, narrow-faced, wearing a gray coat too light for the mountain cold. One hand rested near the revolver at his hip. Caleb crouched behind the pines. Sarah was beside him, breathing through her nose to keep quiet. From where they watched, the yard looked almost peaceful. That made it worse. Rebecca wore no coat. Emily had one shoe missing. Frank carried a revolver low beside his leg. Silas Webb stayed close enough to Rebecca that she could not move without brushing his shoulder. Caleb's hand went to his gun. Sarah caught his wrist. He looked at her. She shook her head. Not yet. Caleb's jaw tightened, but his hand stayed where it was. Sarah pointed toward the barn loft. A shadow shifted behind the boards. Daniel. He had not been found. That mattered. Frank spoke loudly enough for them to hear. Boy. No answer. We ain't leaving without you. Rebecca said. He's not here. Frank turned toward her. You expect me to believe he just disappeared? He was gone when you arrived. Silas gave a humorless laugh. Then we find him. Emily buried her face against Rebecca's dress. Rebecca put one hand over the back of her head. Caleb's breathing changed. Sarah felt it beside her. He was ready to stand, ready to cross the yard and become exactly what 3 armed men expected him to become. She leaned close. If you go now, Webb uses Rebecca. Caleb looked at her. She whispered, Give Daniel a chance. His eyes moved toward the loft, then back. 1 second. 2. He nodded. Frank turned toward the younger man. Check the smokehouse again. The man moved away. Sarah saw the opening. She touched Caleb's sleeve. I can get one of them off Rebecca. No. The answer came instantly. She looked at him. No? You're not walking into that yard. Sarah's eyes narrowed. Even now. Caleb saw it too. His face shifted. He lowered his voice. I'm asking you not to. That stopped her. For half a breath. Then Sarah looked toward Rebecca. I heard you. Caleb almost objected. Sarah was already moving. She stepped from behind the trees. Frank! Every head in the yard turned. Caleb closed his eyes once, very briefly. Then he shifted behind the trunk of a pine where he could still see her. Sarah walked into the open. No shotgun. No weapon at all. Her brown coat moved in the wind around her skirts. Frank stared. Well, Silas swore quietly. Rebecca's face changed. Sarah, no. Sarah ignored her. Frank raised the revolver slightly. Thought you'd gone to town. I did. Should have stayed there. Sarah kept walking until she was 20 feet from the wagon. That depends. On what? On whether you want the cattle ledger. Frank went still. Silas looked sharply at him. What ledger? Sarah saw it. Good. Not all 3 men knew everything. Frank said, She's lying. Sarah reached slowly into her coat. The younger man drew his revolver. Sarah stopped. Easy. She pulled out a folded book. Not Caleb's ledger. A kitchen account book Rebecca had left on the sideboard. From this distance, it did not matter. Frank's eyes fixed on it. Sarah held it by one corner. I copied the missing brands. Frank's face changed. You what? Dates, too. Silas stepped away from Rebecca. Just one pace, Sarah continued. Names of buyers. Silas turned toward Frank. You told me there were no names. Frank snapped. She doesn't know anything. Then you won't mind if I open it. Sarah let her thumb slip beneath the cover. Silas moved another step toward her. Rebecca now had space on one side. Caleb saw it. So did Daniel. High in the loft, the boy moved. A board creaked. Frank looked toward the barn. Sarah raised her voice. Looking for this, Frank? His attention came back. Exactly what she wanted. Daniel crawled along the loft floor. The old ranch bell rope hung beside the hay doors. Caleb had mounted the bell years ago so hands in the lower fields could be called in during fire or runaway cattle. The rope was 5 feet from Daniel, then 3, then 1. The younger gunman turned toward the sound. Caleb stood. "Hey!" The man spun. That single word was enough. Daniel grabbed the rope. The bell rang. Once. Loud. Metallic. It rolled across the valley. Then again. And again. Frank shouted. Daniel pulled with both hands. The bell hammered over the ranch. Sarah threw the false ledger beneath the wagon. Silas lunged after it. Rebecca shoved Emily toward the water trough. Caleb crossed the yard. Fast. Frank fired once into the dirt beside him. The horse at the hitching rail reared. Caleb hit Frank before he could raise the weapon again. Both men crashed into the corral fence. A rail split beneath their weight. Frank lost the revolver. It skidded beneath the wagon. Sarah reached Emily first. She pulled the girl behind the trough and dropped beside her. "Stay low." "Mama?" "I know." Rebecca was still near Silas. He grabbed her arm. She twisted hard. "Let go of me." He tightened his grip. Rebecca's other hand found the long iron brake handle hanging beside the wagon. She swung it once, not at his head, across his forearm. Silas cursed and released her. Rebecca ran. The younger man started toward them. Then George Harris's voice came from beyond the gate. "Drop it!" 3 riders appeared on the road behind him. 2 Morgan hands. 1 neighboring rancher. The bell had carried. The young gunman looked from Caleb to George, then slowly let his revolver fall. Frank did not notice. He and Caleb were still fighting beside the broken fence. Frank was strong, stronger than Sarah expected. But Caleb was something else. He caught Frank around the middle and drove him against the corral post. Frank struck his shoulder. Caleb barely moved. "Where's the rest of my cattle?" Frank shoved away. "Go to hell." Caleb hit him once, hard enough to put him in the dirt. Then he stopped. That mattered. Sarah saw his fist draw back again, saw the anger in his face, saw 4 years of loss and weeks of fear gathering behind it. "Caleb." He froze. Sarah stood several yards away with Emily behind her. Caleb looked at her. She shook her head. That was all. His fist lowered. George reached Frank and bound his wrists with a length of rawhide. Silas sat against the wagon wheel holding his arm. Rebecca stood over him breathing hard, still gripping the brake handle. For one long moment nobody spoke. Then Daniel called from the loft. "Can I come down now?" Rebecca laughed, then covered her mouth. The sound broke something loose in the yard. Emily ran toward the barn. Sarah caught her before she reached the broken corral. "Yes," she called. "You can come down." Daniel appeared at the loft ladder. Caleb looked up. The boy stopped halfway. "Did I do right?" Caleb crossed to him. Daniel climbed the last few rungs. Caleb put both hands around the boy's shoulders. "You did." Daniel swallowed. "I was scared." "I know." Caleb pulled him close. No hesitation, no looking around to see who watched. Daniel disappeared against his uncle's coat. Rebecca turned away. Sarah did too. Not because she did not want to see. Because some moments belonged to the people inside them. By noon, the yard was full of riders. A deputy came from Dry Creek after George sent one of the neighbors. Frank's bunk was searched. They found a second cattle book beneath a loose floorboard. Dates, brand changes, payments, names. Enough to tie Frank and Silas Webb to cattle sold under altered marks across 2 counties. The deputy closed the book. "This'll do." Frank sat tied to a chair in the bunkhouse. He no longer smiled. Sarah stood on the porch while the prisoners were loaded into the wagon. Caleb came up beside her. His knuckles were scraped. One sleeve had torn at the shoulder. Sarah looked at his hand. "You should wash that." "Yes, ma'am." She glanced up. He was almost smiling. "Don't start." "I didn't say anything. You were thinking it." "That sounds familiar." Sarah looked away before her own smile could appear. For a moment, the world seemed to settle. Rebecca was safe. Daniel was safe. Emily was eating a biscuit on the porch step. Frank was finished. The missing records had been found. There was nothing left for Sarah to fix. That thought arrived quietly. Too quietly. Caleb went with George to speak to the deputy. When he returned 20 minutes later, Sarah was gone from the porch. He checked the kitchen. Rebecca was there. "Where is she?" Rebecca looked toward the hall. Caleb already knew. He walked to Sarah's room. The door was open. Her trunk sat on the bed. Sarah was folding the green dress Rebecca had altered for the harvest social. Caleb stopped in the doorway. "What are you doing?" Sarah laid the dress inside. "Packing." His face changed. "Why?" She looked at him. "The danger's over." "Yes." "Rebecca's well." "Yes." "The children are safe." "Yes." She closed one side of the trunk. Caleb stared. Sarah's hands rested on the wood. "You wanted me safe." "I did." "I am. That's not what I meant." "No." He stepped into the room. "No." Sarah waited. Caleb opened his mouth. The same problem. The same silence. Only this time she did not rescue him from it. She folded the last apron and placed it in the trunk. Outside, the ranch bell moved once in the wind. A single hollow note. The family was safe. Frank Turner was finished. And somehow that frightened Caleb Morgan less than the sight of Sarah Parker packing to leave him anyway. He stood in the doorway while she closed the trunk. The brass latch clicked. Small sound. Final sound. Sarah did not look at him again. "I'll have George take me to Dry Creek in the morning." Caleb stayed where he was. "You don't have to go." Her hand stopped on the trunk. Then she turned. "That isn't the same thing as asking me to stay." The words landed between them. Caleb looked at her. Sarah waited. He knew this moment. Not exactly this one, but the shape of it. Rebecca beside the barn 5 weeks earlier. Emily asking whether Sarah had left because no one told her she belonged. Laura's empty place at the table. Every time somebody had waited for him to say something simple and human, he had found work instead. A fence, a horse, a ledger, something with an answer he could reach using his hands. Sarah stepped around him. "I'm tired." He moved aside. She passed. No argument. No tears. That was worse. That night, the Morgan house settled into silence. Not the old silence. The new kind. The kind that comes after danger, when chairs have been put back upright, and doors have been closed, and everybody is waiting to learn what remains. Rebecca put Emily to bed. Daniel insisted on keeping the ranch bell rope tied beside his bed until George promised nobody was coming back. Caleb washed the cuts on his knuckles at the kitchen basin. Sarah made tea for Rebecca. They moved around one another without touching. Once, Sarah reached for the kettle at the same time Caleb did. Both stopped. She withdrew first. "Go ahead." Caleb poured the water. He wanted to say something. Nothing came. Sarah carried the cup away. At dawn, frost lay white across the lower pasture. Sarah's trunk was on the porch. George brought the buckboard around from the barn and checked the wheel hubs. Sarah wore her brown traveling coat, the same one she had worn into Dry Creek weeks earlier. Emily stood beside Rebecca with both hands wrapped around Sarah's arm. "You could stay until snow." Sarah crouched. "That might be tomorrow." Emily frowned. "Then stay until spring." Sarah smiled. "A real one. Small. Painful. I'll write." Daniel stood with his hands in his pockets. "You hate writing." Sarah raised an eyebrow. "I do not. You made me rewrite 3 pages because my letters leaned. They were nearly lying down." That earned the laugh she wanted. She hugged him. Then Rebecca. Rebecca held on longer. When they separated, neither woman spoke. Sarah turned toward the wagon. Caleb stood beside the corral gate. He had been there for several minutes, watching, waiting. Sarah looked at him. George picked up the reins, then seemed to reconsider something. "I forgot my gloves." They were tucked visibly into his belt. Nobody mentioned it. George walked toward the barn. Rebecca gathered the children. "Come on." Emily started to protest. Rebecca took her hand. Soon the yard held only Sarah, Caleb, and the horses, breathing steam into the cold. Sarah folded her hands in front of her. "You wanted to say something yesterday." "Yes." "So say it now." Caleb looked past her toward the house. The kitchen chimney sent a straight line of smoke into the pale morning sky. "I came home expecting you all to be gone." Sarah said nothing. "Rebecca warned me." "I know. I thought I was prepared for it." He rubbed one thumb over the rough edge of the corral rail. "I told myself it wouldn't matter because she'd be safer east. The children would have cousins. A bigger town. More people." Sarah watched him. Caleb continued. "That was a lie." The horses shifted. A leather trace creaked on the wagon. "I was afraid to come home and find an empty house." His eyes moved to hers. "And then I did come home." Sarah's mouth tightened slightly. "You found us." "No." Caleb shook his head. "I found something else." He stepped away from the fence. "I found Rebecca alive when she could have been dead. Daniel telling me a stranger pulled him from a creek. Emily hanging on to your skirt, like she'd known you all her life." Sarah looked down. "I found bread in the kitchen. Flowers beside Laura's picture." Caleb's voice changed at her name, but he did not stop. "I found my nephew asking me questions at supper again." He came one step closer. "I found my niece waiting for me to answer, instead of assuming I wouldn't." Sarah's eyes lifted. "And everywhere I looked, Sarah, you were there." Her throat moved. "That doesn't mean you need me." "I know." The answer came quickly. That surprised her. Caleb stood only a few feet away now. "I needed you when Rebecca was sick." "Yes." "I needed you when Daniel was in the creek." "Yes." "I needed you when you found what Frank was doing." Sarah's face held steady. Caleb looked at her for a long time. "I don't need any of those things now." There it was, the wound she had expected. Sarah's chin lifted. "All right." She turned toward the wagon. Caleb reached for her hand. "Not hard, just enough." "Sarah." She stopped. His fingers loosened immediately, leaving her free to pull away. She did not. "I don't want to cook." Her eyes came back to him. "I don't want somebody here because Rebecca needs nursing." He swallowed. "I don't want somebody raising Daniel and Emily because I failed to learn how to sit at my own table." Sarah's fingers trembled once in his hand. Caleb noticed. I want you here when nobody needs saving. Silence. Sarah looked at him as though she had not understood. Caleb took a breath. That was all the time he gave himself before fear could shut him down again. I want you here on ordinary mornings. Her eyes shone. When the coffee burns. A tiny breath escaped her. When Daniel tracks mud across the floor and Emily hides buttons where nobody can find them. Sarah almost smiled. When the cattle are healthy, and Frank Turner is somebody we never speak about, and there is nothing wrong that requires you to fix it. His voice dropped. I want you here then. Sarah's eyes filled. Caleb took another step. I want you beside me because I love you. There. No order. No arrangement. Nothing useful to hide behind. Sarah stared at him. Caleb waited. He did not explain. He did not tell her it would be safer. He did not tell her what she should do. He waited. Sarah looked toward the ranch house. Rebecca and the children were pretending not to watch through the kitchen curtain. The curtain moved sharply when Rebecca pulled them back. Sarah gave a wet little laugh, then looked at Caleb again. As what? He frowned. As what do you want me here? He understood. Not cook. Not caretaker. Not the woman who arrived when his family was falling apart and made herself useful enough to earn another day. Caleb's hand closed more firmly around hers. My wife. If you'll have me. Sarah's lips parted. And if I don't? Caleb's face tightened, but his answer came without hesitation. George takes you to Dry Creek. And after that? I leave you alone. She studied him. You mean that? No. For the first time, Sarah laughed fully. Caleb's mouth finally broke into a smile. I mean, I'll do it. That's different. Yes. She looked down at their joined hands, then back up. You're difficult. I've heard. Stubborn. Yes. You decide things for people. I'm trying to stop. You're not very good at apologies. I know. Sarah raised an eyebrow. Caleb corrected himself. I have been informed. Her smile faded into something softer. What happens when you get frightened again? The question took longer. He looked toward Laura's grave beyond the cottonwoods, then back at Sarah. I tell you. She waited. I don't send you to Cheyenne. That did it. Sarah took one step forward. Caleb stayed still. She placed her free hand flat against his chest. Even through his coat, she could feel his heartbeat. Fast. Much faster than a giant cowboy ought to admit. You are frightened now. Yes. Good. His eyebrows rose. Sarah's eyes filled again. So am I. Caleb looked down at her. May I kiss you? Sarah let him wait 1 second. Only one. Yes. He bent toward her, carefully. Sarah rose slightly onto her toes. The kiss was not dramatic. No wind suddenly rose. No church bell rang. No one cheered. It was warm and uncertain and gentle enough to make Sarah's fingers tighten in his coat. When Caleb drew back, their foreheads remained close. Sarah whispered, George's gloves aren't in the barn. I know. From inside the house came a muffled crash, then Daniel's voice. Emily! Rebecca said something neither of them could hear. Sarah laughed against Caleb's chest. He closed his eyes, and for once the noise from the house did not feel like something intruding on his peace. It was the peace. Winter came early that year. By December, snow covered the lower fences and turned the bighorns white against a hard blue sky. Sarah Parker became Sarah Morgan in the little church at Dry Creek on a morning cold enough that the preacher kept his gloves on until the vows began. Rebecca wore blue. Emily carried yellow flowers because she remembered. Daniel stood beside Caleb and spent most of the ceremony trying not to stare at the cake waiting in the back room. George Harris cried. He denied it later. Nobody believed him. There was no grand wedding feast, just roast beef, potatoes, biscuits, apple cake, coffee, and enough neighbors crowded into the church hall to make the windows steam. Sarah wore the green dress again. Caleb noticed. "You kept it." "Rebecca threatened me." Rebecca, standing 3 feet away, said, "I did not." Sarah smiled. Caleb looked at her longer than he needed to. This time she let him. Weeks later, deep winter settled over the ranch. One evening, Caleb finished checking the cattle just before dark. Snow squeaked beneath his boots. His shoulders were powdered white. He came around the barn and saw the kitchen window glowing. He stopped. Inside, Sarah stood at the table rolling pie dough while Emily attempted to copy her with a piece much too small to matter. Daniel was arguing with Rebecca about arithmetic. George sat near the stove repairing a glove. Someone had left boots in the wrong place. A wooden spoon lay on the floor. The kitchen was crowded, untidy, loud. Caleb stood outside and watched. 4 years earlier, he had believed grief had emptied his life in a way nothing could refill. So he had made himself useful, reliable, necessary. He had mistaken survival for living because survival required less courage. Then one evening he rode home expecting the house to be empty. Instead, a plus-size stranger stood on his porch with his shotgun in her hands and flour on her apron. She had saved his sister, saved his nephew, protected his niece, protected the ranch. But somewhere along the way, Sarah had done something nobody asked her to do. She had reminded Caleb that being needed and belonging were not the same thing. The kitchen door opened. Sarah stood there. Her sleeves were rolled to the elbows. There was flour on her cheek. "You planning to stand there all winter, cowboy?" Caleb looked at her, then through the doorway at the family behind her. "I was thinking. That's dangerous. I've heard." Sarah held out her hand. Caleb walked toward her. "What were you thinking about?" He reached the porch. Sarah's hand disappeared inside his. Caleb looked once more at the glowing kitchen. "Just making sure it's real." Sarah squeezed his fingers. "It is." She pulled him inside. The door closed against the snow. Emily immediately accused Daniel of stealing pie dough. Daniel denied everything with his mouth full. Rebecca laughed. George moved his chair closer to the stove. Sarah returned to the table, and Caleb took his place beside her. Nothing needed saving. Nobody needed rescuing. There was no danger at the gate, no flood in the creek, no missing cattle, no reason for Sarah Morgan to remain except the one reason she had wanted all along. She was loved there, and when Caleb looked around the noisy kitchen, he finally understood something his sister had tried to tell him before the cattle drive. A roof could shelter people. A ranch could feed them. Strong walls could keep out snow. But none of those things made a home by themselves. People did. People who stayed. People who asked instead of assumed. People who carried one another when the load became too much and still reached for each other after there was nothing left to carry. Caleb had once believed loving someone meant giving fate another thing it could take away. Sarah had learned the opposite. Sometimes refusing to love was simply another way of losing people before they were gone. She reached beneath the table and found his hand. Caleb turned his palm upward. Their fingers joined, and outside, snow kept falling over the Wyoming territory, while the Morgan house remained bright against the dark. Imagine yourself standing where Caleb once stood, looking through that kitchen window after years of believing the safest heart was one that needed nobody. Imagine realizing the woman inside had already seen your silence, your stubbornness, your fear, and had chosen to love you without asking you to become someone else first. Sarah had spent years being welcomed whenever there was work to be done. Caleb had spent years making himself useful so he would never have to admit how badly he needed a family. Somehow, they met in the middle. Maybe that is what second chances sometimes look like. Not a grand promise, not a perfect life, just someone reaching out a hand after the storm is over, when there is nothing left to prove. Because love is not only about who stays beside us when the river rises or danger comes through the gate. Sometimes the deeper question is who stays on the quiet mornings afterward. If you had been Sarah, would you have stayed? And if you had been Caleb, would you have found the courage to ask? Tell me in the comments. And if stories about wounded hearts, unexpected love, family, and the long road toward healing mean something to you, I hope you'll subscribe. There are many more stories waiting down that trail, and I'd be honored to share the next one with you.